Rome didn't always kill defeated queens. In fact, death was often withheld. Instead, Rome chose something far more deliberate. It chose visibility. When a queen fell into Roman hands, her body did not disappear from history, but her power did. She was kept alive long enough to be seen, long enough to be remembered in the way Rome wanted her remembered, not as a ruler, not as a rival, but as proof. Proof that resistance ended here. Proof that conquest reached beyond armies and into identity itself. Survival was not mercy, it was a message. These women were stripped of the things history usually preserves: titles, voices, control over their own stories. What remained was silence, carefully staged and publicly displayed. And when the record finally closed around them, it closed without explanation. No sentence was written for what followed, no law defined it, no inscription admitted it, because Rome never needed to explain itself. And Rome was very deliberate about why. To understand why Rome treated defeated queens differently, we first have to step inside the Roman mind, a world where power was not only exercised but performed. In Roman warfare, killing an enemy king was simple. Kings were commanders. Once defeated, their authority died with them. A king's execution marked the end of a military problem. But queens were something else entirely. A queen did not merely rule, she embodied rule. She represented continuity, bloodlines, dynasties, sacred legitimacy. To her people, she was living proof that their society had existed before Rome arrived and might one day exist again. As long as a queen remained dignified, remembered, or revered, the idea of resistance remained alive. Rome understood this instinctively, and Rome feared it. This is why queens were rarely treated as ordinary prisoners of war. They were too symbolically dangerous to dispose of quickly. Killing a queen could turn her into a martyr. Martyrs inspire memory. Memory inspires rebellion. Rome wanted neither. Instead, Rome chose transformation over execution. A defeated queen, kept alive and reshaped, became something far more useful than a corpse. She became evidence. Evidence that Rome did not simply defeat enemies, it absorbed them, redefined them, and emptied them of meaning. In this way, queens became living propaganda. Roman conquest was not just about controlling territory, it was about controlling narrative. Triumphs were staged, coins were minted, statues were carved. Every victory had to be visible, repeatable, and unmistakable. A living queen, stripped of authority and placed on display, told a clear story. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome. And importantly, it told that story without Rome ever having to say it aloud. This distinction mattered deeply in Roman political culture. Rome liked to see itself not as cruel, but as orderly, not as brutal, but as inevitable. Violence was reframed as justice. Domination was reframed as civilization. Executing queens too quickly risked exposing the raw brutality beneath that image. Survival, by contrast, could be framed as mercy, even when it was anything but. Roman ideology was also profoundly gendered. Conquest was imagined in masculine terms: domination, penetration, control. Land was feminized. Cities were described as taken. Enemies were described as broken. Queens, therefore, occupied a uniquely symbolic position. They sat at the intersection of political power and gendered meaning. To conquer a queen was not only to defeat a ruler, but to assert dominance over the very identity of a people. This is why queens were treated differently from kings, generals, or nobles. Their punishment was designed not merely to neutralize them, but to invert them. Where a queen had once commanded, she would now be commanded. Where she had once represented sovereignty, she would now represent submission. Where she had once spoken for a nation, she would now be silent. And Rome was meticulous about how this inversion occurred. Public visibility was essential. A queen who disappeared too quietly could still be mythologized, but a queen who was seen, altered, diminished, carefully controlled, could not be easily reclaimed by legend. Rome did not want heroic endings, it wanted instructional ones. Execution was too merciful because it ended the story too cleanly. Death closed the narrative. Survival allowed Rome to rewrite it. By sparing queens, Rome positioned itself as both conqueror and arbiter of fate. Life itself became conditional. A queen lived because Rome permitted it, and lived in the way Rome prescribed. This sent a powerful message not just to conquered peoples, but to Rome's own citizens. It reinforced the idea that Roman authority extended beyond law and battlefield, into identity, dignity, and memory. Queens were not spared because Rome respected them, they were spared because Rome needed them. Needed them to demonstrate dominance without appearing chaotic, needed them to educate future enemies, needed them to show that resistance did not lead to glorious death, but to prolonged erasure. In Roman triumphs, enemies were often paraded through the streets, not merely to celebrate victory, but to ritualize it. These displays transformed war into theater. They allowed Roman citizens to witness power in motion, to see hierarchy enforced in flesh and posture rather than words. Queens, when present in these spectacles, carried unmatched symbolic weight. They were living reminders that even the highest forms of foreign authority could be bent, reshaped, and absorbed into Rome's order. And after the crowds dispersed, the lesson remained. Because Rome's goal was never just to win wars, it was to prevent future ones. By making queens visible in defeat, Rome attacked the psychological foundation of resistance. It taught conquered peoples that leadership itself could be undone, that sovereignty could be humiliated, that survival did not guarantee dignity. This was conquest refined into ideology. And once the lesson had been delivered, once the symbolism had done its work, Rome no longer needed spectacle. What followed next was quieter, more controlled, and far more enduring. What followed next was not punishment, it was theater.
Rome did not celebrate victory quietly. Conquest, in Roman culture, was never meant to fade into the background of memory. It was meant to be seen, absorbed, and remembered, not only by the defeated, but by Rome itself. Every successful campaign was transformed into ritual, and every ritual was designed to turn power into something visible. This is where captured queens entered Rome's most carefully staged performance. War, for Rome, ended on the battlefield. Conquest began in the streets. At the heart of this transformation stood the Roman triumph, a public procession granted by the Senate to victorious generals. These were not spontaneous celebrations. They were meticulously planned events, governed by tradition, symbolism, and hierarchy. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was excessive by Roman standards. Every detail existed to communicate a single message. Rome was eternal, and resistance was futile. Triumph parades followed a strict order. Spoils of war came first: gold, weapons, banners, sacred objects taken from conquered lands. Then came captives, and among them, when fate aligned a certain way, were defeated rulers, kings, princes, generals, and sometimes queens. The presence of a queen in a triumph was rare, but profoundly meaningful. Queens were not simply defeated enemies, they were living symbols of sovereignty undone. Their appearance in Rome's streets turned abstract conquest into a human image the crowd could fixate on. For the queen, the procession was not about humiliation through cruelty, it was humiliation through contrast. Everything about her presence emphasized reversal. Once she had been elevated, seated on thrones, addressed with reverence, surrounded by symbols of power. Now she walked, slowly, publicly, watched by thousands who did not know her name, her language, or her history, and did not need to. Rome required no narration. The image spoke for itself. Clothing played a crucial role in this spectacle. Queens were not always strict of finery, but what they wore was carefully chosen. Sometimes they appeared in foreign royal garments, not to honor them, but to emphasize their otherness. Their attire marked them as conquered, as exotic, as trophies rather than dignitaries. In other cases, they were dressed simply, even plainly, their previous splendor deliberately absent. The message shifted slightly, but the meaning remained the same. Authority had been removed. Royal dignity in Roman thought was not inherent quality, it was something granted, and therefore something that could be revoked. Posture mattered just as much as clothing. Queens did not speak during triumphs. Silence was enforced, not merely expected. A speaking captive could complicate the narrative. A silent one confirmed it. A queen who did not address the crowd allowed Rome to speak for her. Silence became control. Every bowed head, every measured step, every moment of stillness reinforced the illusion that Rome's dominance was natural, uncontested, and complete. Even when the queen's thoughts were unknown, her visible compliance told a story Rome wanted repeated. This is where capture crossed into psychological warfare. The triumph was staged for the defeated alone. It was staged for Roman citizens, to reassure them of order, hierarchy, and the righteousness of empire. Seeing foreign rulers humbled affirmed Rome's self-image as the center of the world. It also served as a warning to others. Foreign envoys attended these events. Delegations from allied or semi-independent territories watched carefully. They understood the unspoken lesson. This was not merely what happened to enemies, this was what happened to rivals. Queens, in particular, embodied the highest possible stakes. Their visibility told other rulers, especially women in power, that Rome recognized no sacred authority outside itself. And yet, the spectacle did not end when the parade ended. After the crowds dispersed and the streets were cleared, the queen's role shifted. Public theater gave way to controlled disappearance. The humiliation did not escalate, it settled. Captured queens were removed from the center of attention and placed into carefully managed environments, private residences, political households, or restricted estates. This transition was deliberate. Rome did not want pity to replace awe. Prolonged visibility risked sympathy. So Rome changed the setting. Inside Roman society, the queen became something else, neither free nor publicly condemned. She existed in a suspended state, where her presence was known, but her voice was absent. This was another form of erasure. She was no longer introduced as a ruler. Her titles were dropped. Her lineage was rarely mentioned. Over time, she became a footnote, referenced only in relation to the Roman men who had defeated or controlled her fate. What Rome removed first was not freedom, but context. Without context, memory fades. Queens who survived conquest often lived long enough to watch themselves disappear from history. Their names were preserved only in Roman records, and even there, filtered through Roman values, Roman language, Roman judgment. This was not accidental neglect, it was structural. Rome's rituals were designed to reorder reality. Triumphs redefined who mattered. Silence redefined who was remembered. Over time, the queen's original identity was replaced by the identity Rome assigned her. Defeated, subdued, resolved. Even when kindness was extended, housing, protection, a controlled form of comfort, it served the same purpose. It demonstrated that Rome decided the terms of existence. This was the quiet brilliance of Roman spectacle. It avoided overt cruelty not out of compassion, but out of efficiency. Violence shocks. Control endures. And by transforming conquest into ritual, Rome ensured that power outlived the moment of victory. Clothing, posture, silence, these were not details, they were instruments. They allowed Rome to dominate without chaos, to humiliate without disorder, to erase without bloodshed. Over time, the spectacle achieved its final goal. The queen was remembered not for who she was, but for how she was defeated. Her story became inseparable from Rome's triumph. Her survival no longer threatened rebellion, it reinforced submission. And yet, for all its precision, Roman spectacle had limits. Some queens lived long enough to pass from public memory entirely. No procession could preserve their names forever. No silence could fully erase their origins. They survived, but not as Rome's trophies, and not as their people's rulers. They survived as shadows. But some queens survived long enough to be forgotten.
Before Rome reduced her to a cautionary tale, Boudica was power made visible. She was not a ceremonial queen, nor a symbolic consort ruling in someone else's shadow. She was a sovereign in her own right, tall, commanding, and unmistakably present in the political life of Iron Age Britain. Roman writers would later describe her appearance with fascination, even discomfort, because she did not fit Rome's expectations of how power should look on a woman. To her people, the Iceni, Boudica represented continuity. Her authority was rooted not only in lineage, but in custom, loyalty, and shared identity. She ruled alongside her husband, King Prusitagus, but her influence did not end with his death. In fact, it was his death that revealed just how threatening Rome found her. Prusitagus had attempted compromise. In his will, he named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his daughters, hoping this gesture would protect his kingdom from full annexation. It was a calculated act of survival, one Rome chose to interpret as weakness. Rome did not honor the agreement. Instead, Roman officials moved swiftly to dismantle Iceni autonomy. Lands were seized, nobles were stripped of status, and Boudica, the queen Rome had not yet faced in battle, was publicly humiliated. Roman sources describe a moment that marked the true beginning of rebellion. Boudica was flogged and her daughters were violated as a demonstration of Roman authority. The intent was unmistakable. This was not punishment for rebellion, this was provocation. Rome was sending a message: queens could be broken before they were defeated. What followed shocked Rome. Boudica did not retreat into silence, she mobilized it. Uniting the Iceni with neighboring tribes, she transformed personal violation into collective resistance. Her speeches, preserved only through Roman writers, emphasized shared suffering and stolen dignity. She framed Rome not as a civilizing force, but as a parasite feeding on submission. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Rome lost control. Roman strongholds fell one by one, settlements were destroyed, Roman citizens and collaborators fled or were killed. To Roman observers, the rebellion was not merely military, it was symbolic chaos. A woman had dared to reverse the hierarchy Rome believed was natural. This is why Boudica's revolt terrified the empire. It was not just that she defeated Roman forces, it was that she exposed Rome's vulnerability. She revealed that imperial authority depended on compliance, and that compliance could fracture. Rome responded with overwhelming force. Legions regrouped, commanders adapted tactics, the rebellion was crushed decisively. Tens of thousands were killed, and once again, Rome controlled the narrative. But here is where Boudica's story becomes complicated and deeply revealing. Roman historians disagreed about how her story ended. Some accounts claim she took poison to avoid capture. Others suggest she died of illness. What matters is not which version is correct, but why Rome needed to offer them at all. Because Rome understood the danger of a living Boudica. A surviving queen who had nearly destroyed Roman authority could not be allowed to exist publicly. Execution would turn her into a martyr. Imprisonment would keep her symbol alive. Silence, therefore, became the most useful outcome. Roman writers shifted focus away from Boudica as a leader and toward Boudica as a warning. Tacitus, one of Rome's most influential historians, framed her rebellion as emotional excess, a woman driven by rage rather than strategy. Cassius Dio emphasized her unnatural authority, portraying her power as an aberration rather than a legitimate challenge. These portrayals were not neutral. They stripped Boudica of rationality. They reframed political resistance as hysteria. And by doing so, they preserved Rome's self-image as orderly and justified. Boudica's survival, however brief, was already too dangerous, so Rome ensured that what survived instead was a version of her that could be safely dismissed. What Rome did next was subtle but effective. The Iceni were absorbed, their leadership was dismantled, Roman administration replaced local authority, and Boudica's name faded from living memory, preserved only in Roman texts that framed her defeat as inevitable. This was Rome's preferred outcome. Not a queen remembered for resistance, but a queen remembered for failure. Not a sovereign, but a lesson. In this sense, Boudica's survival, whether literal or narrative, became the final stage of Roman domination. Her body may have escaped Roman punishment, but her story did not. Rome claimed it. By controlling how Boudica was remembered, Rome ensured that future generations would not see her as proof that resistance was possible, but as proof that resistance was futile. This is the quiet brutality of imperial history, not just the crushing of rebellion, but the rewriting of meaning. Boudica had been powerful before Rome. She had been defiant during Rome, but after Rome, she was reduced to a symbol Rome could tolerate. Her survival did not protect her legacy, it dismantled it. Rome did not need Boudica dead to win, it needed her transformed, from ruler to rebel, from leader to warning, from history to footnote. Rome didn't need her dead, it needed her broken.
Public spectacle was only the beginning. Once the crowds dispersed and the triumphal banners were folded away, Rome's conquest entered a quieter phase, one far less visible and far more enduring. For many captured queens, this was where their lives truly changed, not in the streets, not before cheering crowds, but behind walls, under watchful silence, inside the private spaces of the empire. This was captivity without chains. Rome rarely imprisoned queens in dungeons. There was no need. Their confinement was psychological, cultural, and administrative, enforced through proximity, surveillance, and gradual erasure. A queen inside Rome was not treated as a criminal, but as property with political value. And that distinction mattered. Life inside Roman households was carefully controlled. Captured queens were often placed in the homes of high-ranking Roman officials, generals, or influential families. These were not acts of generosity. They were acts of containment. Within these homes, queens lived surrounded by Roman customs, Roman language, Roman expectations. Every day reinforced the same reality. Their survival depended on adaptation. The absence of overt violence is what made this phase so effective. A queen who was beaten might resist. A queen who was publicly mocked might inspire sympathy. But a queen who was quietly absorbed could disappear without resistance. Meals were eaten according to Roman customs. Servants spoke Latin. Religious rituals followed Roman gods. Over time, the queen's native language became unnecessary, then discouraged, then forgotten. Without language, communication narrowed. Without communication, identity thinned. This was not accidental. Rome understood that culture survives through repetition. Remove repetition, and culture weakens. Remove culture, and resistance loses its foundation. Political marriages played a central role in this process. Some queens were married off to Roman allies or client kings, not as equals, but as stabilizing instruments. These marriages were framed as alliances, yet they functioned as guarantees. A queen bound to Roman interests through marriage could no longer represent independent sovereignty. Children born from these unions were raised Roman. They learned Roman history, Roman values, Roman loyalty. The queen's lineage continued, but detached from its original identity. Rome did not end bloodlines, it redirected them. In this way, queens became bridges between conquered lands and imperial control. Their bodies symbolized reconciliation, their silence symbolized acceptance. Yet this acceptance was carefully manufactured. Hostage queens occupied a peculiar space within Roman society. They were visible enough to remind Rome of its reach, but invisible enough to prevent influence. They attended certain events, but never as authorities. They were introduced not by titles, but by associations: the wife of, the daughter of, the captive from. Their former status was never acknowledged directly, only implied through absence. This is how trophies work. A trophy does not speak, it is displayed. Time accelerated the erasure. Years passed, new generations rose. Roman historians recorded events without revisiting the queen's origin. Her name appeared less frequently, sometimes altered to fit Latin pronunciation, sometimes omitted entirely. When referenced, she was framed as an example of Rome's clemency rather than its control. This reframing mattered. Rome preferred to see itself as merciful. By allowing queens to live comfortably, at least outwardly, it justified conquest as benevolent governance rather than domination. Comfort became camouflage. But comfort did not equal autonomy. Queens could not leave without permission. They could not return home. They could not speak publicly about their past. Their movements were monitored, their correspondence restricted, their influence carefully measured. They lived, but within boundaries that grew tighter with familiarity. Perhaps the most devastating loss was the quietest one: the loss of name. Names anchor memory. They carry lineage, history, and belonging. Roman records often replaced native names with Latinized versions or titles that stripped individuality. Over time, the original name faded from use, surviving only in fragments, if at all. A queen without her name became easier to forget. Without language, culture, or title, what remained was a presence stripped of context. A woman once surrounded by meaning now existed in isolation, defined not by who she had been, but by where Rome had placed her. This was Rome's quietest violence: not execution, not spectacle, but absorption. Captured queens did not always suffer visibly. That is precisely why their stories vanished. History remembers dramatic deaths. It remembers rebellion. It remembers spectacle. It does not remember silence. Rome relied on that forgetfulness. By erasing queens privately, Rome avoided creating martyrs, avoided provoking outrage, avoided preserving symbols of resistance. What remained was stability, manufactured, controlled, and normalized. And when later generations looked back, they saw peace rather than disappearance. But beneath that peace lay deliberate loss. Some queens were never humiliated in public. They were never paraded. They were never punished openly. They were simply removed from memory, from culture, from history. Some queens were not humiliated in public, but erased in private.
Cleopatra Selene was born into a world of power and prestige. She was the daughter of Cleopatra VII, the last true pharaoh of Egypt, and Mark Antony, one of Rome's most celebrated generals. From birth, her life was intertwined with the fates of nations. She was royalty by blood, but she was also, tragically, a political instrument from her earliest days. Her mother's empire had fallen to Rome. The defeat was catastrophic. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman system, and Cleopatra VII took her own life to avoid the humiliation of captivity. Yet Cleopatra Selene herself survived, captured, transported to Rome, and placed under the watchful eye of the very empire that had destroyed her family. She was a child in the hands of conquerors, but Rome did not treat her as a prisoner in chains. Instead, they raised her in elite Roman society, surrounded by tutors, aristocrats, and the children of influential Roman families. Her education was extensive: Latin, Roman customs, rhetoric, and history. She learned how Rome saw the world, its power structures, and its social hierarchies.
At first glance, this life might seem generous, but there was a calculated purpose behind every lesson. Education was not a gift, it was a form of control, a way to shape identity, to mold a royal child into someone who could no longer claim her heritage fully. She was allowed to survive, to learn, to grow, but only within the confines of Rome's ideological framework. As Cleopatra Selene grew older, Rome arranged her future to cement political alliances. Her marriage was no personal choice, it was a strategic instrument. She was married to King Juba II of Mauritania, a client king loyal to Rome. Through this marriage, Rome extended its influence and ensured that Cleopatra Selene's royal bloodline would continue, not as independent rulers, but as part of Rome's sphere of control. The marriage had multiple layers of significance. It legitimized Roman authority over newly conquered lands. It provided a sense of continuity for local populations who might otherwise have resisted Roman rule. And it neutralized Cleopatra Selene as a potential source of rebellion. By controlling her life so completely, from education to marriage, Rome controlled the legacy of one of the most famous dynasties in the ancient world. Despite the comforts she received in Rome and later in Mauritania, Cleopatra Selene's life was marked by the quiet loss of self. Her identity was constantly mediated by the empire that had destroyed her family. She was a queen, yes, but her queenship was circumscribed by Roman expectations. She was allowed to hold power, but that power existed only where Rome permitted it. Her Egyptian heritage, once the foundation of her identity, was gradually recast through Roman eyes. Roman writers documented her life not as a princess of Egypt, but as a carefully managed client queen. Her story became part of Rome's narrative, a tale of survival, but also of subjugation. In her adulthood, she performed the duties expected of a queen, governing alongside her husband, attending ceremonies, and maintaining appearances of authority. Yet behind this veneer of autonomy lay the invisible structures imposed by the empire. Every decision, every public appearance, every action was constrained by the empire's priorities. Her sovereignty was limited, her legacy reframed. What is most striking about Cleopatra Selene's story is the emotional depth of her captivity. She survived the empire that had destroyed her mother, escaped death, and navigated a foreign culture with intelligence and grace. And yet, her survival came at a cost. Her identity was no longer fully her own. She was a queen raised by the conquerors, living under their terms, performing her life according to their design. Her story exemplifies the quiet cruelty of empire, not through overt punishment, but through careful control, psychological shaping, and the systematic redefinition of identity. Cleopatra Selene was a living symbol of what Rome could do to royalty: allow life, but shape it entirely to suit the empire's purposes. She survived, but not as herself.
Zenobia of Palmyra remains one of the most remarkable examples of a queen whose defiance threatened the very heart of Rome. Unlike other captured queens whose lives were methodically absorbed and erased, Zenobia's story is filled with tension, uncertainty, and a lasting impression of resilience. Her narrative illustrates not only the power of individual defiance, but also the lengths to which Rome would go to contain it. Before Rome intervened, Zenobia ruled Palmyra with remarkable skill. She was not merely a figurehead. After her husband Odaenathus's death, she assumed control of the Palmyrene Empire, which extended across Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. She managed a sophisticated administration, maintained military campaigns, and positioned Palmyra as a regional power independent of Roman oversight. Her authority was both political and symbolic. She embodied the city's prosperity, military ambition, and cultural identity. Zenobia's defiance was direct. She did not submit quietly, as other queens often did. She challenged Rome openly, extending her influence in territories that Rome considered within its sphere.
Her decisions were bold. She assumed the title of Augusta, minted coins in her own name, and led armies to secure Palmyra's borders. In her actions, she demonstrated a rare combination of intelligence, courage, and political acumen. Rome could not ignore Zenobia's audacity. The empire, accustomed to subjugating rulers through calculated displays of power, faced a queen whose influence could not be quietly absorbed. Military intervention was inevitable. Roman legions marched to reclaim territories under her control, and Palmyra faced direct confrontation. Zenobia's forces were ultimately defeated, but her capture was far from straightforward. When Zenobia was brought to Rome, the spectacle of her submission was carefully staged. Unlike other queens whose lives were quietly managed in private households, Zenobia's public appearance was meant to communicate Rome's victory to the masses, while also showcasing the empire's magnanimity. She was displayed during triumphs, yet she retained an aura of dignity and defiance that made her presence unforgettable. Her treatment, however, differed from other captured queens. Rather than erasing her identity or reshaping it entirely, Rome used her survival as a tool for propaganda. She was paraded as a symbol of Roman power, but unlike many queens, she maintained elements of her individuality, her intellect, and her commanding presence. The tension between her autonomy and Roman control created an enduring story, one that captured the imagination of contemporaries and historians alike. The accounts of Zenobia's later life are conflicting. Some Roman sources suggest she was allowed to live comfortably in a villa, possibly even granted certain honors by Emperor Aurelian. Others claim she lived in obscurity, stripped of titles, but retaining her royal dignity. Coins, inscriptions, and scattered historical references provide clues, yet none offer a definitive conclusion. This ambiguity has preserved her legend, allowing generations to speculate and admire her resilience. Zenobia's story demonstrates the limits of Rome's control. Unlike Boudica or Cleopatra Selene, she was not fully absorbed or silenced. Even in defeat, her presence could not be entirely erased. The uncertainty surrounding her fate enhances her legacy. She survived, but her life remained constrained. She retained her identity, but under the shadow of an empire that had conquered her. For the audience, Zenobia offers a rare glimpse of hope and contrast within the dark history of conquered queens. Her story suggests that survival does not always mean total erasure, and that defiance can leave a lasting impression, even when confronted with overwhelming power. Yet Rome's handling of her life reinforces a central theme. The empire controlled the narrative. Zenobia's survival was permitted, but only on Rome's terms. Her image was curated, her movements monitored, and her story reframed. Even in apparent leniency, the empire asserted dominance, showing that power can survive in forms that seem generous, yet remain fundamentally controlling. The legacy of Zenobia reminds us that conquest is never only physical. It is psychological, cultural, and symbolic. The way Rome treated her reveals both the limitations of imperial power and the enduring strength of individual agency. Rome told more than one version of her ending.
When the triumphs ended, the crowds dispersed, and the spectacle faded, the story of the captured queen did not. It continued quietly, invisibly, behind the walls of Rome and in the private chambers of its elite. Yet unlike the public displays, the parades, the formal processions, the calculated humiliation, what followed was far less visible, and that is where history begins to obscure itself. The queens who survived conquest often vanished from the records. They were no longer subjects of public fascination or political debate. Their presence existed in private spaces, Roman households, villas, estates, and occasionally client kingdoms, where their lives were circumscribed by the empire's priorities. In these spaces, identity, memory, and narrative were carefully curated. The empire did not need to kill them, it only needed to control how they were remembered or forgotten.
Rome had mastered not only the art of conquest, but also the art of storytelling. It was not enough to defeat armies or topple dynasties. The empire needed to dominate memory itself. Writing, recording, and historiography became tools of control. Captured queens were mentioned in texts only insofar as they served the empire's narrative, as defeated, as subdued, as examples of Rome's power and mercy. Details of their agency, their survival, their influence, these were omitted or reshaped to suit imperial ideology. Some historians note that cruelty was normalized precisely through this erasure. When the public sees a ruler paraded, controlled, or disappeared quietly, the human dimension of suffering becomes abstract. The lessons Rome intended, obedience, submission, the futility of resistance, take root. The absence of a queen's personal story reinforces the sense that survival is conditional and that power is absolute. The psychological effect of this quiet erasure is profound. By removing names, voices, and stories from history, Rome taught that rebellion could be contained not only through force, but through memory itself. Survivors were transformed into instruments, their presence a warning, their absence a lesson. They existed, but only as Rome permitted them to exist in the collective consciousness. In this slow, almost imperceptible way, cruelty became normalized. The public was not shocked by the violence, they internalized the quiet power of the empire. Authority was not enforced solely through spectacle, but through narrative. Who was remembered, who was omitted, and how stories were told. Even kindness could be weaponized, as it demonstrated Rome's discretion and judgment. Life itself became a tool of domination. The queens themselves were trapped in this system. Survival came with conditions: silence, compliance, assimilation. Over time, language, culture, and memory were stripped away. Their presence became a living lesson in humility and submission, teaching other subjects what it meant to fall under Rome's control. Each day of their continued existence was a reinforcement of the empire's ideology, a subtle but unrelenting exercise in authority. When modern viewers look back, it is tempting to focus on the spectacle, the parades, the dramatic humiliation, the visual evidence of dominance. Yet the true horror lies in the quiet aftermath. The queens who survived were not publicly punished, yet their autonomy was obliterated. They lived, but only as Rome allowed them to exist. Their names faded from common memory, their stories were rewritten or omitted, and in this quiet disappearance, the empire's control proved even more absolute than any battlefield victory. By the time history books were written, the empire had already shaped its narrative. The subtle, everyday control of life and memory became invisible to outsiders. Observers saw peace, order, and governance, but the lived reality of these queens was one of ongoing containment and erasure. Their suffering was not dramatic, it was systemic, institutionalized, and normalized. This is where the audience begins to feel unease, not shock. Unlike the immediate horror of public humiliation or violence, this quiet oppression lingers in the imagination. It asks difficult questions. How does a society erase its enemies without blood? How does control over memory perpetuate power? And how many other lives were quietly remade, broken, or forgotten to reinforce an empire? History in this way becomes complicit in Rome's strategies. By recording only what serves authority, by neglecting what does not, the chroniclers of the empire help enforce the same erasure experienced by the queens themselves. Names vanish, stories fade.
the human dimension is abstracted into lessons of control, obedience, and the futility of resistance. The quiet horror of post-conquest life is not the immediate violence, it is the enduring, invisible dominance of power over identity and memory. Queens who once wielded authority, inspired loyalty, and symbolized entire cultures were reduced to shadows in archives, footnotes in records, and subjects of speculation. Their survival existed only to reinforce the permanence of Roman control, the inevitability of empire, and the futility of defiance. Some queens were not humiliated in public, but erased in private.
By the time we reach the final chapters of this story, a clear pattern emerges, one that is both methodical and chilling. Rome's treatment of captured queens was not isolated. It was a blueprint for domination, a combination of spectacle, psychological control, and historical manipulation that shaped the fates of women in power for centuries. The first thing to recognize is how systematic Rome's approach was. Every action, from public humiliation to private erasure, served multiple purposes at once. It neutralized a political threat, reinforced Rome's ideology, and communicated to both the conquered and the citizens of the empire that rebellion would be contained. Queens were treated differently from kings because their symbolic power posed unique dangers. Their survival became a tool, their erasure a mechanism, and their stories a form of instruction. Rome's legacy is visible in the empires that followed. Historians note that later civilizations, from the Byzantine Empire to various European monarchies, adopted similar methods when handling conquered or rival queens. Public displays, political marriages, and the careful control of historical narratives became recurring tools. The psychological principle was always the same. Power is more durable when exercised quietly and symbolically, rather than through overt violence alone. In many cases, women were central to this method precisely because they symbolized continuity. Kings could be executed and replaced. Queens embodied bloodlines, dynasties, and cultural memory. Neutralizing or reshaping queens allowed empires to control not just territory, but identity itself. This approach repeated across centuries. Rulers learned that controlling the representation of women in power could stabilize conquest far more effectively than brute force alone. The consequences of this approach are profound. By normalizing cruelty through control, whether through spectacle, captivity, or historical erasure, Rome and subsequent empires set a precedent. These actions communicated a clear message. Authority is absolute, rebellion is dangerous, and the fates of those who resist can be managed, manipulated, and redefined. This is why such crimes repeat in history. Conquerors observed the effectiveness of Rome's methods. They recognized that public executions and battles, while dramatic, could inspire memory and rebellion. Instead, they learned to employ subtler, long-lasting forms of control, the manipulation of narrative, the appropriation of women as political instruments, and the quiet restructuring of identity. The queen who survives is not a ruler, she is a living lesson. We can see the pattern clearly. Defeat and capture. Remove the queen from her sphere of influence. Public display. Transform political power into spectacle for psychological impact. Private absorption. Reshape identity, language, and autonomy to neutralize future threats. Historical control. Rewrite the narrative so that memory serves the conqueror, not the conquered. This four-step sequence becomes a repeated template across empires. It demonstrates how Rome's strategies were less about individual cruelty and more about the construction of durable systems of domination. It is a legacy of calculated power, a pattern that persists because it works. By studying these queens, we gain insight not just into Rome, but into the broader dynamics of empire. History is not only a record of battles and treaties, it is a record of how societies manage authority, memory, and identity. The fates of these women reveal a persistent truth. Controlling history is as important as controlling armies, and the subjugation of symbols, often embodied by women in power, is central to sustaining empire. Ultimately, the story of Rome's treatment of captured queens forces us to confront uncomfortable realities. The repetition of such practices is not accidental, it is structural. Empires, past and present, often rely on the same principles: suppress threats, reshape identities, and manipulate memory to reinforce control. By tracing this pattern, we can better understand why history seems to repeat itself, particularly when it comes to the lives of women caught at the intersection of power and conquest. Rome left more than ruins. It left a pattern, and that pattern, embedded in the mechanics of empire, echoes across time.
As we draw this story to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on what Rome's conquests truly reveal. History often celebrates Rome's grandeur, its roads, aqueducts, architecture, and military genius. Statues and monuments immortalize its victories, and textbooks recount its achievements with admiration. But beneath this celebrated exterior lies a quieter, more insidious legacy, one that rarely makes the history books, yet shaped the lives of countless women, the daughters of conquered lands, whose stories were rewritten, silenced, or erased entirely. The queens we explored today, Boudica, Cleopatra Selene, Zenobia, and many others, remind us that conquest is not only about armies and battles, it is about control, narrative, and memory. Rome mastered this subtle form of power. The public spectacles, triumphs, and parades impressed the masses. The private erasures enforced assimilation, and historical revisions ensured that dissent and autonomy were neutralized for generations. These women survived, yet only as instruments of imperial authority. Their agency, voices, and identities were often absorbed or muted. This duality is the essence of Rome's quiet crimes. The empire built lasting infrastructure and cultural achievements, yes, but it also built silences in which the lives of women who opposed, survived, or endured conquest were forgotten or reframed. Their experiences became invisible to most, recorded only selectively, shaped by the perspectives of conquerors. The greater the empire, the more effective the erasure. It is crucial to acknowledge this silence, not as a failure of history, but as a window into the mechanisms of power. By understanding how Rome controlled memory, we see that conquest is not only an event, it is an ongoing process, extending beyond the battlefield and into the realms of identity, narrative, and legacy. The roads may still stand, but the stories of the women who once traveled, ruled, or resisted along them are often lost or manipulated. In reflecting on these stories, we also confront a broader truth. History's quiet crimes persist because they are subtle, enduring, and often invisible. Rome's methods were not confined to a single century or geography. Later empires observed, adopted, and refined them. Political marriages, hostage queens, public displays, and controlled narratives are tactics repeated throughout time. Silence and erasure remain as powerful as swords, and their effects ripple across generations. So as we conclude, consider this. The greatness of Rome, or any empire, cannot be measured solely by the structures it left behind. It must also be measured by the lives it reshaped, the voices it silenced, and the stories it controlled. Understanding this duality allows us to see history with more nuance, empathy, and awareness. And for those captivated by these hidden narratives who wish to see history through a lens that honors the voices of the silenced, here is the call to action. Subscribe to History's Quiet Crimes. Explore the stories that Rome and history itself tried to erase. Every week we uncover new narratives of courage, survival, and the hidden human cost of empire. By engaging, sharing, and commenting, you become part of a community that refuses to let silence dictate memory. Remember, Rome built roads that still stand, but it also built silences that still echo. Let us listen to them.